It's the NUFC Monday Show, and on today's episode we're going to be looking at reports that Eddie Howe's had cleared the air talks with Newcastle United, wondering whether we should be worried that there's no transfer activity, and taking a look at one specific new striker target. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for the continued support. I'm looking to get to 500 subscribers before the start of the new season. We're currently on 489, so I just need a push of 11 to reach that target. Still looking into doing some live streams, so get down in the comments and get liking this video if you want to see some of those. There's lots to talk about in terms of a perception thing about where Newcastle are this summer, and where the sort of the feeling is going into the new season. I know there's lots of people getting a little bit twitchy out there because there's a lack of transfer activity. You're seeing rivals going above and beyond as well. It's got to be a little bit unnerving, so I'm here to sort of discuss that. But we're going to start with another chapter of the Eddie Howe and Newcastle United future situation. Obviously, it's been quite a tricky road for Newcastle since they came back from their summer break. Eddie Howe's been linked with the England job. He's had conversations in the press where he's openly sort of talked about his demands and warning the club. Apparently, since then there have been reassurances from him, according to Luke Edwards from the Telegraph, that he will have a good say on transfers, and it's a collaborative thing that he's part of the future. Darren Eales has got to really work hard, I think, to make clear to everybody, particularly Eddie Howe, that he is the man to coach this team going forward in the way that suits Eddie Howe, with also incorporating Paul Mitchell, who I think I've said this before, he wouldn't come in, Paul Mitchell, if he wasn't going to get a massive say on how things are run, because he's had other job offers, he's turned down other job offers before, but there's got to be a reason why he's keen to come to Newcastle. What is it? And I think partly it's to do with control, the fact that the Saudi Arabian PIF have been the ones to hire him without telling Eddie Howe. There's got to be a power play, and it's down to Newcastle and down to Darren Eales to make it work. By the sounds of it, there's been positive talks with Eddie Howe. Howe is apparently happy to stay at Newcastle. He said so much around the England job, but as I said in the last video, the England job at the moment is fairly irrelevant, because until it's offered, until there's something tangible on the table in terms of where the FA want to go with it, there's lots of talk that he's the main guy, but until that happens, Eddie Howe can't really talk about England. So he was only answering questions in terms of being happy at Newcastle within relation to the new setup, and I think he'll use the England interest if it's there to leverage something. He's obviously just signed a new contract in 2023. That wasn't mentioned on my last video, but that's something that Darren Eales said in his interview, that Eddie Howe had signed a contract that wasn't reported. So it's not about money, it's about control for Eddie Howe and about how he fits into this whole thing. Who's had a huge say in quite successful recruitment over the last 2.5 years. I know lots of people talk about interest in certain players and constant links with the likes of Dominic Solanke is a great example of somebody who he's worked with before, and this sort of constant idea that he wants to be getting the old band back together. But in practice, that hasn't really happened. Newcastle have signed Anthony Gordon, they've signed Bruno Guimaraes, they've signed Alexander Isak, they've signed some real quality players. Nick Pope's come in as a really, really good Premier League quality goalkeeper. There's not a great deal of examples in terms of what Newcastle have done where they've really missed their goal in terms of a good transfer. And Dan Ashworth previously, before he left, said that Newcastle have to hit their targets with pretty much every transfer because they're trying to close a gap in terms of PSR and in terms of financial situations, while also competing with the clubs that they're trying to reach in the league for the same players, and that's obviously going to be a challenge, but we'll see where that goes. So the talks are positive, but also I think really Eddie Howe and Newcastle fans need to see some action in terms of transfers, because there is a little bit of nervous energy out there, as I've mentioned, as I've sensed, around what's happening with the transfer market. There's only really Lloyd Kelly who's come in to improve the first team picture. You've got Odysseas Vlachodimos and John Ruddy as well. Lewis Hall's obviously coming on a permanent deal, but that doesn't really feel like a new momentum building signing. There hasn't been one of those real statements been made yet, and I think there's understandable little bit of concern there, but at the same time, the Euros, the Copa America, and the PSR situation taking up the majority of June. That's really why this has happened. Whether you like it or not, whether you accept that as the reason or not, that is kind of where Newcastle have been this summer. And unfortunately, there's going to be a difficult navigation spell for Newcastle and anybody else who's trying to find a way through this market. It's quite a difficult time to do a transfer window when you've got the Euros, you've got the Copa America, you've also got the Olympics as well. There's a lot, people forget that there's a lot of key players who go away for the Olympics who Newcastle might be trying to buy at that sort of right age range of around 23 and under. That's the age range of the Olympics. There's lots of quality players in that competition that Newcastle might be interested in. So there's different types of different times of holiday and lots of things that are being thrown around as sort of reasons why. But I think things will pick up before the start of the season, before they go and play Southampton in that first game in August. I think there will be a couple of players in by then who will transform the team. I'm not sure they need too much in terms of the first 11. There's just a lot of squad depth, I think, that you need. I think crucially Newcastle do need to make signings of players who would challenge the first team rather than come in as squad building players, because they did mostly last summer, and a lot of other factors here, but ultimately they lost momentum. So it's really important that they do sign a couple of really big players here, and obviously the right winger and the centre back are the main priorities. I think the right winger is really, really interesting. Obviously, there's links with Federico Chiesa. I will warn against the Chiesa stuff because obviously he's been talked about in terms of £17 million, €20 million, a year left on his contract at Juve. It's a great deal. He's 26, and obviously, for the same reasons that I sort of made the point about Jonathan David, there's a lot to say about Chiesa coming in for that sort of price, being available for that sort of price. Who'd be interested? Plenty of clubs, because his quality is obviously there, but he's suffered with a lot of injuries. He's not played too much in the last 3 years. I think a lot of people think back to Euros in 2021 when he was absolutely phenomenal. If you can get him back to that level, absolutely brilliant. But at the same time, I think that there's got to be a warning here about Chiesa, because the way he is seen at Juve and how willing they are to get rid of him, I think that's got to be a warning. And I said about Serge Gnabry last week, you've got to be wary of clubs using Newcastle as a way of trying to find a deal for a player that they don't want. Why are Juve not willing to sign him onto a new contract? Why is he available such a cheap price? Yes, on paper it looks like a great deal. He's the right age. As I say, he's had so much quality, and it's obvious at the highest level that he's such a good player. But I think the risk is too great because he's been injured. He's not been in great form. Picked it up a little bit last year. I haven't got the stats to hand. Generally speaking, he's had a tough few years, and Newcastle need to be buying players, and their success rate when doing this in the new era of buying players who are on the up, who have a point to prove, who are hungry, who are going in the right direction, signing players from their level or maybe even the level below, and giving them a chance to grow. You've seen that with Gordon, Isak, Pope, players who've come in and made an impact, who made a real difference to the team, rather than sort of going and getting a player with the idea of resurrecting them from a higher level, if you like. Juve obviously challenging for titles in Serie A, they're back in the Champions League after a year out of Europe because of financial misgivings. They're not willing to sign Chiesa to a new contract. You've got to wonder why. I think the risk around resurrecting, in effect, Chiesa's career is too great, and I would look at somebody maybe not of the level on paper of Chiesa, but is going in the right direction. You've seen what they've done with Anthony Gordon, with Isak, with Bruno, with Botman, players who are of the right age, but also crucially on form and going in the right direction with a lot of promise, not a sort of lot of risk and sort of, can you get this out of a player? That's too much for me. I think Chiesa is not the right player for Newcastle United, and I've just hope you understand why I've explained that. And I think they will look. He's been linked with Newcastle for a number of years now, and he might well be on a list of potential right wingers. In Luke Edwards' report, there's been talks of players being put to Eddie Howe at home and abroad as different positions. That's how it's going to work now. Paul Mitchell will find the players. The scouting network, which he's going to overhaul, will find the players. They'll come to Eddie Howe and discuss it then. Chiesa may well be on a list, but I don't see this one actually going forward because there's just too much risk about it. Injuries, form, general issues. Also his wages, £150,000 at Juve. That would put him at the very top end of Newcastle's wage structure, which they've obviously been very keen not to overinflate too quickly. So I think the whole thing is a little bit too risky. If you compare that to Jonathan David, who's on great form at a good age at 24, and also a cheap wage structure as well, 27-30 grand at the moment at Lille, there's a great deal to be done. That's the difference between Chiesa and David, and I think that you've got to look at other players in that sense of the right deal. It's not just got to be on paper, that's a great player, he's the right age. You've got to see how they fit into Newcastle. I think Paul Mitchell, Eddie Howe, and everyone else who's looking at the recruitment side of things will have to take that into account. Before we get into the striker link I mentioned at the top of the show, let's talk about Callum Wilson, whose injury situation has got worse again. He's had a back problem. He's going to have some surgery if he's not already, and he's going to probably miss the first game of the season. Lots of talk about Callum Wilson. I've said on this channel I think he'll probably go. He's obviously got the quality to impact Newcastle, but whether he stays on the pitch enough, if they can find a buyer, I'm sure they'll look at that. With a year to go on his contract, if you renew his deal, you're going to have to pay him the same amount, which is over £100,000 a week. He's 33 next season as well. There's just too much risk about it. Personally, as I said previously, I would look to sell him if you can, bring somebody like David in, reinvigorate that striker. I think the idea that you have three strikers looks good on paper. When Isak is the player who's going to be playing all the time, having three players who want to play so much would be very difficult. Two strikers isn't too bad when you've got players who you can trust to play, and the trouble with Isak and Wilson is that they've both had a record of breaking down with muscle injuries over the last couple of years. Having two strikers is fine, provided that one of them at least is regularly fit, and I think Jonathan David's record suggests that he would be, so that's a good option for me. But Jhon Duran is the link that's been put around today. To be fair, it's more that he's on the verge of signing for West Ham. He's been linked with Chelsea in the past. Newcastle have been credited with an interest. I think this one's a non-starter purely because the cost that Villa would want, around 40 million, that was the talk about with Chelsea. Has he really proven it? He's not really been a regular starter for Villa. In terms of that, he's the right age. Physically, he's very good. He's got a great goals to game record as well. For me, he would fit that bill in terms of competing with Isak, but the money you would have to put out for him, and the fact that I think he wants to go to West Ham where he may well play regular football, live in London as well. There's plenty of that sort of thing going around too. So I think that this one is very unlikely to happen. I do think that something will happen in the next couple of weeks. The last thing I'd say is that lots of people have credited Newcastle over the last couple of years with making signings out of absolutely nowhere. You know, Sandro Tonali, Alexander Isak, they've come from very little rumours beforehand. So let's not get too bogged down in the fact that those rumours aren't coming out around players now. Anything can happen very quickly at Newcastle. We've seen that before. I think things are in motion, especially after a few difficult weeks with a lot of different moving things with the PSR situation, the Euros, the Copa America, but also you've got Eddie Howe's future up in the air and just trying to reconfigure this new setup at Newcastle. Everything is taking a little bit longer because so much has gone on in the background. Now it seems to be getting a little bit better with the clear the air talks for Eddie Howe. The fact that the season is now in sight. They've got Hull City at the weekend, a game that I'll be at before they go to Japan. Come back for the Seller Cup. Hopefully I'll be there as well. And then we start the season against Southampton. Thanks very much for joining me on this video. Please like, share and subscribe. Try to get to 500 subscribers. Also, please do continue to drop likes on these videos if you want to see some live streams. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.